Hello, I'm Alice Matthews, and what are you? It's something I've heard a lot throughout my life, and on this week's episode of Insight, we're talking about being mixed race and what it's like finding your cultural roots.
I never met another Filipino that I wasn't related to until I was 12.
Wow.
So I kind of felt quite separated from Mum in a lot of ways, from people outside of our family telling me that I was different to her.
I had a teacher for a whole year who used to call me a dirty little girl.
I would say that I'm black, but my peers would say, no, you're mixed. And there would be this constant debate about my blackness.
The biggest challenge has been the loss of culture and the sense of knowing where you're from.
Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being in the studio. It's actually so nice to be here together. Tess, when did you first realise you were mixed race?
Yeah, so I think as a very young child, colour definitely wasn't something that I recognised. But I have a very distinct memory of being around 8 or 9 years old and coming into school one day and the teacher saying to me, "Oh, Tess, who picked you up from school last night? Was it a friend of the family, a nanny?" And I was like, "Oh no, that's my mum." And I could see that she was quite shocked because I have a different skin colour to my mum.
And that was your teacher saying that to you?
That was my teacher. And so I think that made me have a thought that was like, well, am I different to my mum? What is it that she's noticing here?
And you're here with your sister Ori. Ori, what about you? When did you first realise about your background?
I think it was probably a little bit later for me in high school, and other kids, I guess, kind of being a bit cheeky in the way that they were asking the question and being like, what is your mum? I don't think I clearly knew the answer, but for me, I gave them quite a smart response back, and I was like, oh, like, she's female, or like my mum. And maybe without me kind of really knowing, was trying to call out their racism, but because I knew that they were referring to the fact that she was a different colour to me, and that she was darker.
Yeah, I used to have friends that would say, you know, Alice, when they ask you like where you're from, actually what they're saying is like, what kind of brown are you?
Yeah, definitely. I know. And people go, where are you from? I'm like, Bendigo? Like, yeah. Like, no, but like, really? And you're like, no, really, that's where I grew up.
Yep, it's true. Sally, you're Tess and Ori's mother. How long has your family been in Victoria for?
Yeah, so my family first came to Victoria in the 1850s, so as part of the gold rush.
Your grandmother married a white Scottish man and they had 5 children, including your father. What did he tell you of his African-American background?
Well, he was absent in my life, so he didn't tell me anything. We basically found out, I suppose, through the relationships with my aunties and my uncles. So the connection for me with that side of the family was quite strained. And I remember actually not really understanding where they fitted in.
So what was your mother like?
So my mother was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very pale-skinned lady, not unlike Tess, and she had the English-Irish background.
What was your childhood like after your mum remarried?
It wasn't a bad childhood, but certainly I felt that I didn't fit in. So when she remarried, again, she married a very white person, blonde hair, blue eyes. They have a lovely daughter who also has white skin and blonde hair and blue eyes. And my sister and I were obviously, very different. Jodie was a very loved child. She was her father's firstborn child, so she was quite special in that sense. And we were less so important, I think. And when we went to athletic carnivals, Mum would often come back and say, oh, people were probably wondering where we got those black children from, because they can see that you don't belong with us.
How did that make you feel?
Well, you'd kind of go, don't we belong? And even though you knew that you did, and I think I look a lot like my mum, and just like I think Tess looks a lot like me, but people often see the colour, they don't see features, I suppose. Yeah.
Sally, you're 54. Have you experienced any racism in the wider Bendigo community?
Probably not a lot as a smaller child, or whether I did and perhaps didn't recognise it, not sure. But certainly it began through the teenage years. I do remember having gotten my licence and, you know, got pulled up by the police 3 times in 1 week. Wasn't doing anything, wasn't speeding, just happened to be pulled up 3 times in a week.
Wow.
I always, and still to this day, get pulled up by the police a lot in my car. They quite often don't think my car is mine, or, there's assumptions. Yeah.
Tess, how did having a different skin tone to your mum impact your sense of self?
Yeah, it was something that was confusing for me growing up, and it's something that I'm still not 100% kind of sure about. I definitely feel as though I identify with her in a lot of ways. I feel like we look very similar in our features. But again, growing up, people would say, oh, you look so much like your dad, which I do look like my dad too, but I know that they were just looking at my skin colour. And so I feel like I was constantly searching for things that were the same, that would make me be similar to her, make me feel like I belonged more. And certainly, you know, at family gatherings where we've been with mum's father's side of the family, I really have felt like I haven't fitted in. And so it's something that I'm confused about, and I'm still not reconciling the fact that I am Caucasian appearing, but there is something in me that is, you know, a person of colour.
Ori, what do you say to people who ask what your background is?
I think never the same thing. I'm always super baffled, I think, about what to say. And I think because for such a long time, mum wasn't 100% sure. So that's always been a really challenging thing. And I think I experienced that a lot through high school. And now my partner is Aboriginal, and I get asked increasingly more than I ever have in my whole life. And I think it comes from 2 things. People assume because I'm with him that also Aboriginal, or they just don't know. And so some of it comes from other Aboriginal people saying, oh, like, what mob are you?
What do you say to that?
I feel bad that they have assumed that I'm Aboriginal, or that they think that I'm Aboriginal. And not that it's a bad thing to be Aboriginal Australian. I would be so proud to be Aboriginal Australian, but I don't want to misrepresent them as, you know, a white appearing person that, you know, very heavily benefits from white privilege. And I'm like kind of trying really hard to correct them, but then still don't actually have the right words or the terminology to say, oh, I am this. So I often address it and be like, oh, like there was some like African-American background, but a bit of Scottish, a whole lot of different types of white. But I, you know, grew up on Dja Dja Wurrung country.
Sasha, you were born in Geelong. What's your cultural background?
So I identify as a First Nations woman. My mother, she's First Nations. We're from the Wajunbara Yidinji Jidabal tribes from far north Queensland. And my father is African American.
And you lived in the United States for most of your childhood, right?
From the age of 3 to 9.
What was it like growing up mixed race in America?
It was difficult because being a young person, you don't know too much about identity. So for me, I would say that I'm black, but my peers would say, no, you're mixed. And there would be this constant debate about my blackness. And I was deemed as mixed because I was lighter skinned. And learning about the light skin privilege, as a child, you don't understand what that's all about. But I knew I was treated differently from my other friends who were more melanin rich. And then coming back to Australia at the age of 9, it was such a culture shock because I had just come from a society that was quite fast-paced, keeping up with the Joneses, is very ambitious. And so now I have cousins, uncles and aunties, and we're living on country for the first time. And that was daunting because I didn't know what being Aboriginal meant. It was the first time that I was connected with mob. And that was very hard because I didn't look like the rest of my family members. And I had cousins asking my mom, like, why does she talk like that? Like, why does me and my siblings talk with a heavy American accent? You know, I had sneakers on and they'd want to go play in the bush and, you know, play around in the creek. And here's this kid with like clean sneakers. Like, I didn't get with the program, so to say.
Did you keep the sneakers on or did you?
No, I took them off eventually. And it was just learning how to connect with a community that you never knew. And it was funny because I always gravitated to other Indigenous cultures within the States, not knowing why I felt like I was at home. And then until I came back to Australia, it all made sense to me. But trying to feel comfortable in my Aboriginality was very difficult growing up.
Sasha, how did your high school peers in Cairns treat your blackness?
It was like a double-edged sword. So when I would say I'm Aboriginal, there was a level of disgust and shock and this eerie kind of silence that came with it. I was told, you know, you're too pretty to be Aboriginal from a young age, like 11 years old. So from that point on, I knew within myself and through other people that there was like this dirty stain that was put against you because of your Aboriginality. When I was in high school, like that was the rise of rap and hip hop and R&B, and it was cool. Everyone wanted to know me because of my African American side. It was like this palatable blackness. And so there was just this, you know, tossing and turning in my identity. One part of me, I didn't feel comfortable being Aboriginal because of how other people viewed me. On the other side, I felt confident and noticed for the first time and felt like I could embrace some part of my blackness.
Jordan, your mum is Filipino-Australian and your dad is Anglo-Australian. How do you reconcile the two?
I've always seen it as a bit of a tug of war of identities and of your soul, of my soul, because they're two extremes. And I've always seen it as being able to have been raised with a balance. So having as much to do with, I guess, the Anglo-Australian side of my family, then to try my best as an adult to understand the Filipino side of my family. So for me, you know, growing up as a young boy in a very white neighbourhood, you know,
This is Sydney's Sutherland Shire.
in the Sutherland Shire, that's right. A very, you know, an inherently white neighbourhood. I had to try and discover what it meant to be Filipino and mixed race myself, independently.
Jordan, would you say you were connected to both cultures as you grew up?
I don't think so, because Filipino families, stereotypically, a lot of noise, a lot of room, you know, a lot of family gatherings, everyone knows each other's business. We didn't really have that. And I think as a kid, I would have really have loved to have had that as well, because I think I would have understood myself a little better.
What kind of impact would it have had on your sense of self?
Well, I think it's funny, I have this memory of sitting in the backyard of one of my uncle's houses and they were playing basketball, and it's such an inherent part of Filipino culture. And they're just rigorously playing basketball, you know, the sweat's pouring off them. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to play sport, you know? And I thought, well, hang on. So I think maybe had I engaged in that a bit more, perhaps I would have learnt the language earlier on. I would have understood my past and my mother's past. Instead, I waited until I was, you know, in my early 20s to really kind of hone in on that and understand how it made me a person.
Jordan, when you were 12, you were on a train trip with your grandmother, your Lola. What happened that day in December 2005?
Well, a day that, you know, ripped apart this country and still rips apart this country. It's the Cronulla riots. We were on a train headed to Cronulla and we were doing shopping and we started seeing these masses of people, and I just remember the people drinking, carrying on. We all know it was disgusting and horrible. And she saw what was happening. She took me off the train and put me on the train to go home.
Why?
She was concerned for my safety, and she continued on. And from that day, I understood resilience more than anything. You know, this woman was 75. She wasn't scared of them, but what she was scared of was her grandson taking that in. Yeah.
After the Cronulla riots, your family moved suburbs. What kind of an impact did that move have on you?
Well, we moved to Rockdale, to Brighton Le Sands, thereabouts, and it was just a bit more multicultural, you know, and I started seeing kids that looked like me. I'd never met another Filipino that I wasn't related to until I was 12.
Wow.
You know, that's how anglicised my former neighbourhood was. So I started seeing kids that, you know, spoke in dialects, that ate their, you know, motherland foods and all that. So it was great. And I think we moved because I think we wanted a change of pace, and we wanted to, you know, see a world that really did reflect of what we should be.
Sam, you were born in Sydney in 1963. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Canberra. I was adopted, and being coloured, there wasn't a lot of people who wanted to adopt a coloured child. Everyone wanted white, so I sat in the hospital for 3 months until Mum and Dad came along and said, we don't care what colour the baby is, and came to Sydney to adopt me and took me to Canberra, and that's where I grew up.
What do you know about the circumstances of your adoption?
My biological mother, she was 18 years old, from a very traditionally Greek family, and it was just the biggest no-no to have a baby out of wedlock, let alone to a Chinese guy.
Did you grow up with siblings?
I grew up with an adoptive sister who's red hair, blue eyes, very fair skin, and it was very tough having a sister who was biological to my white family.
When did you first realise you were mixed race then?
From the word go, I mean, my adoptive parents did say our little adopted daughter.
Right. So you knew early on.
Oh, rather. Yeah, I was just so different. And yeah, with that came a lot of problems.
How were you treated at school?
By teachers, by other kids, absolutely rejected. I had a teacher for a whole year who used to call me a dirty little girl and send me off to the girls' toilets every day. Go and wash your disgusting skin. And for some reason or other, my knees are a bit darker than the rest of me. And that was the focus of her, calling me dirty. And so off I'd go every day to the toilets, get the soap and try and rub my skin white.
How did your parents approach raising a mixed race child?
There's a term in the adoption world that we use, and my parents used it. It's called colourblind. And so my parents had no awareness, and any time I had something to say about taunts or anything, it was, oh yeah, just blow that off and it's not happening.
Sam, where did your support come from?
Support? What's that?
Oh,
It didn't exist. Not whatsoever. I just couldn't approach my parents. I mean, if anything, my adoptive sister tried to support me, but she's the only one in my whole years of growing up.
were you accepted at all by your wider adoptive family?
My adoptive father's mother, my adoptive grandmother, she wouldn't even acknowledge me, even though I went to her place regularly. You know, Dad would take us there. I was considered black to her, and so there was rejection there. And so I grew up in a state of shame.
Was your mixed race heritage then something you ever wanted to change?
Oh, yeah. I wanted to scrub my skin white. I remember one time there was someone was taking photos at our house, and my great-grandmother was there, my grandmother, my mother, and my sister, and I was pushed aside, and they wanted to take a generational photo. And, oh, you can't be in this. I wasn't welcome, and that's a big statement to make to a 10-year-old kid. And so that feeling of shame, of rejection, it just stays with you.
Growing up, I thought I had to pick a side. So I started to tan and dye my hair darker and try to stay on the Filipino side. And there were other times when I would try to dye my hair lighter so I'd look more German.
Christine, your father's German and your mother's Filipino. How do you feel about the term mixed race?
Mixed race, I actually don't like it.
Okay.
To me, saying that you're mixed race is like you're diluting your cultures. And for a long time, for a large part of my life, I would say that I'm mixed. But I've just come to realise, actually, no, I'm not mixed. I'm not half Filipino, half German. I am Filipino and German. I have two cultures.
You grew up in Sydney. What was your childhood like?
I'm an only child, and for a large part of my life, it was really lonely, really confusing as well. I do have a large Filipino family, and I have a lot of cousins, and to me, they're like siblings, and we're really close. Mm-hmm. But I still felt the difference. I don't speak Filipino. I can understand some, but not all. And I have lighter skin, so it really did feel like I was still left out in some way.
Did you have much connection to your German side?
No, not at all. There were no Germans growing up, except my dad, of course. There were no Germans in the community as well. And that side of my family, it's quite mysterious.
So who kind of helped you through this grappling of your identity?
I'd have to say my school friends. So the group of friends I had were from all different cultures. And so I'd often say to them, I don't know where I fit in. I don't know who I am. I don't fit in with the Filipinos. And they'd say to me, you're one of us. And to me, that was just so comforting. And I had, for the first time, a sense of belonging.
Christine, how did you rectify the loss of your German culture?
It was at a real risk of being lost. And so I married a German man, essentially, yeah. We met my chance in Australia when he was in Australia on holidays. That was 14 years ago now.
Renee, you're Christine's husband. What's your racial background?
My mother is German and my father is from Côte d'Ivoire. That's Ivory Coast in West Africa.
What was it like growing up mixed race in Germany in the 80s and 90s?
I was born in Germany, grew up in Germany, and basically felt German, but you got reminded constantly that you are different to the other Germans. So that was difficult. The fallback plan that other people may have with different cultures, they can then jump over to the other culture. But I knew that I'm Ivorian, but I never learned the culture. I never learned the language, so I couldn't really properly identify with that side of myself either.
Renee, how has your relationship with Christine been accepted here and by her family?
Publicly, it was not an issue at all. I don't think to multiracial people dating that doesn't alert the village elders anymore these days. And so her family were very welcoming. And once they realized that it's getting serious, they continued asking us when we get married, and that's basically it's been the ongoing thing for every family gathering. The questions, when are we getting married, and to sing karaoke. So I've been failing in both.
But you joined in with the karaoke.
Eventually, not really. Eventually, we got obviously married. But yeah, no, I'm only disappointing in karaoke.
Have you got like a go-to song?
Christine teaches me I'm not ready to go public. I think Frank Sinatra, My Way, is the easiest song that you can sing in karaoke, so that's what I'm going with.
It goes off, certainly with my Philo family. My Way's huge. Christine, did you ever try to change yourself to fit in with either one of your cultural backgrounds?
Yes, absolutely. Growing up, I thought I had to pick a side. Okay, so I'm going to pick Filipino because obviously I look more Filipino, I think. So I started to tan and dye my hair darker and try to just stay on the Filipino side. And there were other times when I would try to dye my hair lighter so I'd look more German. So it was a very confusing time for me.
Sasha, you've been in the modelling industry since you were a child. Have you ever felt pressured to change who you are?
Absolutely. Being a black model, you don't receive as much work as a European model or Caucasian model. And it was hard because that's what the industry is predominantly built on, that monolithic look. And when you did get any jobs, you'd be typecasted for advertising campaigns like selling coffee or chocolate. And as a model, you want to get a really great campaign, a mainstream campaign. You wanted to see yourself in Neighbours or Home and Away, like every other talent had opportunities to.
Did you ever try to change the way you looked?
Yeah, I found myself in a plastic surgeon's office with another model, and we were contemplating getting surgery. Me, I wanted to get surgery on my nose because I felt it was so broad and I hated it. I wanted to have like pixie features or be, at the time I wanted to look like Halle Berry. And in the industry at that time, if you were a model of color or a black model, you were more preferred if you had what they would say, you'd be like a white model dipped in black with the fine features.
You went for a job at Clio. What happened?
That was really weird. It was at a time where I was really discovering my Aboriginality and feeling comfortable in it. And the job required talent of Aboriginal background. And after going to the casting and talking to my agent, the feedback that I got was that I didn't look Aboriginal enough. And that was so triggering because I was saying to my agent, but I'm Aboriginal. And a friend of mine who got the job, at the time I could understand why they chose her, but they didn't understand that Aboriginal people come in different shades, tones, and features. And so in their eyes, she stereotypically looked like an Aboriginal woman. And so I still felt like I'm still not Aboriginal enough because of that moment where someone said, you don't look Aboriginal enough.
Who was supporting you throughout all of this?
I have a very strong relationship with both my mother and father. And growing up, I was very fortunate enough to have a strong sense of self because my mom, she owned the first and only Aboriginal-owned beauty salon in my hometown in Cairns. So at a very young age, I grew up with makeup, styling, facials, self-care, going out to remote communities and working with other young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander girls about self-esteem, confidence, how to carry yourself, not to feel shame. And that really grounded me. And then on the other side, my father, he was very proud and always instilled that pride within me about my First Nations culture because he doesn't know where he's from. Because, as African American people, we're taken from the motherland And I did a DNA test and traced my ancestry. And so I know that as part of the slaves, we were docked in North Carolina. And then within that DNA testing, it came up that I have roots from Ghana, Cameroon, Benin, Togo, and Mali. And for me, it gave me more of a sense of self, because now I can pinpoint where in the motherland am I from. So that keeps me grounded in knowing on both sides that I'm supported.
Sasha, you started a publication called Ascension. Tell me about the philosophy behind it.
It really grew from not seeing a reflection of myself here in this country, particularly in fashion and media. And I got so tired of importing magazines from overseas. And it was difficult because those magazines could only represent me from one cultural background, African American. And I wanted to have a really distinct Australian voice where it was like a one-stop shop for Australian women of colour to hear themselves and see themselves.
Sam, you were adopted as a baby into a white family. At 18, you tracked down your biological mother. What happened next?
Oh, I found her in the electoral rolls, and for 2 years I just sat on it, and then at the age of 20 I decided to go looking for her, and I'd found one of her brothers, and he made a couple of phone calls and half the family came together, and it was probably the most traumatic, most wonderful day of my life to have that blood connection to all of these people.
Did your mother have any other children?
Yes, I've got 2 half-sisters.
Do you know who your biological father is?
No. On my adoption papers, there is a man who she described, and I actually went and met him and had DNA testing with him, and he turned out not to be my biological father.
Right.
So I asked my biological mother again, and she sent me off to another guy, and we got to know each other. It was just so wonderful. And then he said, I just want to make sure. So we went and had DNA testing, and he wasn't my father. So I went and did ancestry DNA and heritage DNA testing, and to try and help find who he was, but it only comes up with the Greek side of my family all over the world.
Do you feel a connection with Asian culture?
Oh, definitely. I've been to Asia maybe 20 times or so, and I feel like I fit in because it doesn't matter where in Asia I go, they think I'm from there, and the locals all speak whatever language of the country I'm in, and I feel very comfortable in Asia.
Renee, what was it like for you visiting Ivory Coast, your father's homeland, for the first time?
I went over when I was 14, I believe, and it was great. It was very interesting to see it, but it also was confusing from a different point of view. So being in Germany and always being second guessed when you're saying that you're German, and when I went over, I was just seen as German. So all of a sudden I wasn't African anymore, I was German. So which kind of showed me that I kind of don't really belong anywhere, which didn't make things any easier. But in general, it was a great experience, and I loved it. And I definitely want to go back and take my family back as well.
Sally, what is the biggest challenge being mixed race?
I think for me, the biggest challenge has been the loss of culture and the sense of knowing where you're from, but it was also little things. And I mentioned my hair a lot, but it's been one of those things that, not knowing how to do my hair has been it's a constant battle, isn't it? Every time we go somewhere. So, and yeah, so it's things like that. So small things, but also really big things about who you are, I suppose. Yeah.
So how did you go about finding more out?
Probably driven a lot by all three of my children. I have a son as well, wanting to know their heritage, and I think it's come to a point where there were lots of discussions all the time about, but what is it really? So my husband bought me the DNA test. There's African, 4 different types of Africans. So Nigerian, the Congo, Benin, and I think Eastern and Southern Bantu as well.
And have those DNA results helped with your hair?
No, but yes. So just knowing that it was African, I went to a African hair festival where it was really great because this girl got up and gave a talk, and she was talking about how it's really important for African communities to make sure that these hairstyles and knowledge about your hair is maintained, even though, these people are now in Australia. And as I was listening to this, I kind of went, oh gosh, that is me. I am the product of the loss of culture and the loss of knowledge, and people not knowing how to do their hair. And yes, it is important that little bits and pieces of your culture are maintained and brought through. And Australia, as a multicultural country, there has to be room for us to have those sorts of skills and knowledge.
Tess, was being mixed race something you ever wanted to change?
No, if anything, it was probably something that I wanted more of. I'm very conscious of my whiteness and the difference that creates for me within my family, but also the privilege that brings me. And I think even just being here on this panel today, there's even a little voice in my mind that's like, oh, but you're white, so you don't deserve to be here to have this conversation.
You do deserve to be here.
I know that I do, but I feel, very conflicted. And so I think that if I had a little bit more of that colour and I looked a little bit more like I was biracial, then I wouldn't have to explain myself so much. And I think that would help a lot.
Ori, your partner is Danzel Baker, aka Baker Boy, the Yolngu rapper and former Young Australian of the Year. How have you been received by his mob?
I've never been so welcomed by people ever in my life, and to literally be told by one of his aunties the first time I went up there, we accept you, we like you and you're welcome, and whatever you want to know, we will tell you. And for me, it just feels like such a privilege to be in that environment and to get to learn. And I think I'm more thankful of it and for all that information that they're willing to share with me because of our loss of culture.
He is just the joy of our lives.
Jetzt muss ich weiter zum Griffalo.
It's really important to me that he grows up with an exposure to all these cultures and languages. I don't want him to have the same loss of identity that I did, and I really worry about that for him.
Look, I'm a big, ugly, bearded guy. I know it says it's a mother's group. Can I join?
You also have 8 children of your own, don't you?
Yes, but I got my figure back, so...
So I never expected to be a father at all.
I just felt compelled to do it better than I'd had it, that's all.
He's almost 5 months now, and his name is Kingston Miles Coffee, and he's just the joy of our lives.
Ich lade dich zum Tee ein, auf meinem Ast. Ein andermal wäre ich darüber sehr froh. Doch jetzt muss ich weiter zum Griffalo.
It's really important to me that he grows up with an exposure to all these cultures and languages. I don't want him to have the same loss of identity that I did, and I really worry about that for him because he's got 3 or 4 cultures, including Australian.
Umso ernster, bisschen lächeln, ne?
Yeah, Kingston was born in February, and that's really the early stages of COVID. And on a daily basis, we took him for a walk in areas that weren't too busy, but that's basically it. He hasn't been to many places and not really willing to take any risks that he gets infected.
We did have another son, Cooper. He passed away 2.5 years ago. He was only 2.5. He passed away from a really rare blood disorder, HLH, that is treated very similar to leukemia. He was a beautiful boy. Oh, it's with his cousins. Oh, so nice.
Cooper's HLH, the permanent treatment, can only be a bone marrow transplant. You do need to have a perfect match, but it is very unlikely to find a perfect match in a person with a different ethnic background, particularly people with mixed ethnic backgrounds.
I just feel if we had a match, Cooper might still be here. Unfortunately, we didn't find a match for him.
After we lost Cooper, we basically put our lives on hold and were in a bad place. And really, we thought the only way out would be to have another child. And when we got the news that IVF was finally successful after many attempts, it was just unbelievable.
He's brought back so much joy to our family, not just Renee and I, but to our wider family. He's our reason for going on and our purpose in life, which we lost when Cooper passed away.
Did you have fun on the swing?
What I hope for Kingston's future, honestly, our normal life. We want him to grow up happy and healthy, embracing all of his cultures.
Mama. Mama.
Christine and Renee, thank you so much for sharing such a difficult story and for raising awareness for the importance of getting more diverse donors. Renee, how do you plan to raise Kingston with some knowledge of all of his cultural backgrounds?
I will make sure that I will teach him the German culture, speaking, reading to him in German, considering maybe German-speaking daycare or an international school. We've decided not to try to squeeze in a third language, in particular, since Christine's family, he won't see them on a daily basis. That would be too complicated, too confusing, which leaves us with the Ivorian side, which is the most difficult one because my knowledge with that culture is limited as well. So we definitely will be trying in particular to stay in close contact with my half-brother who grew up in Ivory Coast. Him and his family, they should be the main contact for Kingston to teach him about the Ivorian side. And last but not least, we're trying and hoping that we'll find a partner for him from the Americas in the future to complete.
Really broaden it out.
bring all continents, all areas of the world into our grandchild.
Christine?
Yeah, I think for us it'll take a lot of deliberateness and we'll have to be proactive. So I'll obviously cover off the Filipino side. I think I'd really like for him to immerse himself in that culture by seeing the family, by even for me cooking Filipino food at home.
Chicken adobo?
Adobo, yes. That's my go-to.
Same.
Yeah, so just as much as we can expose him to Filipino culture, the festivals and so forth.
Jordan, where are you at now with your identity?
I've been very fortunate the past 3 or 4 years to work steadily as a playwright, and I'm creating a lot of narratives out there that are Filipino-centric, that are helping me understand, the relationship with Australia and the Philippines, which is essentially, in a way, who I am. Then I've got this really, really extensive Filipino side that I myself am, at times very annoyingly to some of my family members, ensuring that oral histories and, you know, oral storytelling is preserved in a way, and writing things down and making sure that I can continue to really hone that sense of my identity, because I want my children, you know, to have that sense of being Filipino.
Sam, you've decided not to have children. Why?
I just don't know whether I had the ability to protect any children that I might have had from what I've been through. I would hate my own children to feel rejected in any way, shape or form.
Sam, how has being connected to your biological mother helped with your sense of self and your sense of belonging?
Oh, it's great. It's been a rough road with us, but we talk once a month. And it's great.
Are you still in touch with your adoptive father?
Oh, yeah. Dad, I got so lucky there. Dad has been my absolute rock throughout my life. He may not have understood, but he's never pushed me away. He's the best.
How have you come to terms with your racial identity?
I'm not sure that I have. I had a situation a couple of years ago where a woman was walking past and she looked at me and said, "Go back to where you came from." Yeah, that's only 2 years ago.
Oh, jeez.
And I really question that when I felt like I was totally accepted in such a melting pot of nationalities where I live in Cairns. But also what gives me a sense of self is my friends. They're all white, and they don't look at me as having any colour. They just look at me and say, "Oh, that's Sam." So I get my strength, so much strength from them. It's great.
Thank you, Sam. Tess, how have you come to terms with your cultural identity?
It's something that is kind of probably only just coming to the forefront for me now as something that I'm learning more about. And I think Mum getting the DNA test probably made it more topical in my mind. Yeah, I'm hopeful that it's something that I'll be able to continue to explore and, confirm that identity.
Ori, how have you come to terms with your racial identity?
I think for me, like Tess, it's still very much a working progress. Denzel has been a massive part of me accepting who I am. He identifies me as a person of colour, which is something that I've never identified myself as. And so when I'm like, "Oh, I can't dance, I'm so white," he's like, "But you're black." And I'm like, "Yeah, but look at me." So he's been making me want to find out more and pressuring Mum to find out more and seeking out those answers.
Sally, how do you feel about the term mixed race?
Yeah, I feel that mixed race, to me, is quite a racist thing to say. I think people are people, and I feel that going forward that there will be more people that have many races to them, and I hope that because we're in a world where people are more educated, it's easier to get information, that people will be able to embrace all of those races and cultures, much as the plans we've heard behind us, which are fabulous. And I feel that, there will be more and more people like that,
Sasha, your family's from Wajinburri, Dingy and Gerbil Country in far north Queensland. How important is your connection to mob as you get older?
It's extremely important. When you look at our history, the effects of colonisation, what we have lost, there's this importance of re-establishing and resurrecting the culture and making sure that we pass it down. For me, my journey is different because of the culture that has been lost. It's talking to elders and extended community members to piece together who I am as a First Nations woman. And it hurts when you have to go through archives and anthropological reports to find bits and pieces of your culture that was taken away. So there's a lot of decolonizing that comes with it, and making sure that we don't internalize the past as much as possible. It's acknowledging that.
Sasha, what about your father's side? What have you learnt about your African American history?
We have a very strong relationship, and so that's how I keep connected with my African American culture, and of course the community here in Australia. I've been embraced by the African Australian community, and it's wonderful because I don't think I would have had that opportunity living in the States.
What do you think of the term mixed race?
I personally don't like it because of my experience with it. It othered me, and it was this statement of praise, your proximity to whiteness, the colorism that's attached to that term. On the other hand, I respect other people who use it, because for those who do, they're acknowledging that they have multiple cultures, that they don't want to favour one over the other, and they're quite proud about it. But me personally, it comes with a lot of pain.
How do you identify now?
As a strong First Nations African American woman, I'm double black.
Good on you. Well, thank you all so much for coming and for sharing all of your stories, and thank you so much for watching.